Hi friends, this is Tracy and welcome to Crumb Forest. I want you to dig deep and find all of those winter and Christmas scraps. Check every bin, leave nothing behind. Be sure to watch through the entire video. I will show you 2 different techniques on how to make some scrappy crumb tall pine trees. Now remember, you're only limited to your imagination, so let it soar. Enough talking already. Let's get going to Crumb Forest. The first method that I'm going to share with you is the Total Improv crumb quilting method. If you want more of a deep dive tutorial on this method, you'll have to check out the video in the top right hand corner right here, and it will give you more info in detail on this method. All I've done so far is add 2 pieces together by sewing them, and then I incorporate a third one. There's no rhyme or reason to what I'm doing. I'm just adding fabric to fabric. I'm taking 2 patches and adding a third one on. After I sew that on, I'm then ironing it, making it nice and flat. And then I cut around the edges to make straight edges. And since this is total improv, I have no clue as to what size the end of my tree will be. So I just keep adding fabrics together. You see here I put 2 pieces together, making one longer piece so that I can then cut a straight edge and then add it to the piece that I was just working on. And that's all it is. You would just audition that on the edge, see if the length will work, and it looks like this one will work, but I'm going to slice this right in half because it's a little thick for me, and I like a bit of small to medium pieces in my crumbing. Now that looks pretty good, so I'm going to go ahead and sew those 2 edges together. You will keep repeating the process of adding more crumb pieces and then ironing them really nice with a good hot press so that everything lays nice and flat. Keep going until you get the size that you would like. Speaking of nice and flat, check out my brand new DIY wood clapper that I do have a tutorial on. The video's in the top right hand corner. Check it out. You can even add corner pieces, just like this red piece of fabric here. I'm adding it on an angle. All you really have to make sure is that after you've ironed it, you take a good look at it and see what needs to be trimmed, because you always need a nice straight edge to add even more fabric to. What I'm doing right here is auditioning to see how much more fabric I need on the edge of that double green fabric there. And then I bring in another scrap or crumb to see if it'll work. And it works. So I'm going to add those 3 pieces then to the edge of my work in progress. Now before I sew it on there, I wanted to show you I'm putting it at an angle, but before I sew it, I'm going to go ahead and slice those other edges that are sticking out off so that I have a nice clean side when I go to sew it and press it. Here's a tip for you. When I iron my seam allowances, I always iron to the way that the seam wants to go. When I have a case like this where one seam wants to go one way and one the other, I take a small snip into the seam allowance, being sure not to clip the threads, and then I'll iron one seam to one side and one seam to the other, and all is well. And no one will ever know. Since this is total improv, I'm going to take my hands and just see about where I would like the angle of my tree to go. I'm gauging how much more fabric I may need on the sides or the bottom, and then I just cut accordingly more pieces, more crumb pieces, and connect those together, and then just keep adding on where I think I need more fabric on one side or the other. Total improv crumb piecing is one of my favorite methods. You should really give it a try, but I do have an easier method for you if you like controlled chaos. It's coming right up. Once I add this last piece, I think we're ready for our tall pine tree in Crumb Forest to be on its way to being done. In Crumb Forest, I used all different kinds of white fabric. It could be tone on tone, any kind of print, it doesn't matter because it's all scrappy and crumb. You can even patch together a bunch of different whites, making one big white sheet of fabric too. So what I'm doing is laying the fabric sheet that I just made for my tree on top of a white piece of fabric that's bigger all the way around of the piece of fabric that I just made. You want about an inch or more on the sides and the top. And then I'm just improving with my ruler, cutting up each side, making that triangle tree shape that I was looking for. When I lift up my tree shape, you see I have the white piece there too. I'm just going to set that aside and put that in my scrap bin along with the colored pieces that were cut. And what I'm left with is my beautiful tree shape and my two sides that are white. But what this does is it makes two perfect sides that actually fit my tree. And then I'm going to just add it to the left side there and sew the 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way down. And then I'm going to give it a good hot press. And then I'm going to take the other side of the white piece and I'm going to go ahead and sew the 1/4 inch seam allowance down that side of my tree. Now it's time to trim the main part of our tree block. You need to make sure that you leave at least a 1/4 inch on the sides and the top of your tree, because otherwise your points of your tree are going to get cut off and that will be no fun. You can't have a tall pine tree in Crumb Forest without a tall tree trunk. On this particular tree in Crumb Forest, I actually pieced together the trunk with different browns that I had in my stash, and that was fun to do. Now, when I cut this, I cut it at 3/4 of an inch in width. And that gave me a very tall, thin tree, and I really like the trunk size that I ended up with. Here you can see that I am using all different types and prints of white fabric, and I even pieced one together. I need to make sure that they are as long as I would like my tree trunk. So I'm just measuring up to see how that would go together. You need to make sure that you are covering the white on the sides as the width is of your tree and the white in the main part of the tree. I hope that makes sense. Next, I sewed the tree trunk to both sides of the white so that it's in the middle, and then I'm just going to trim it up on the ends to make it straight so that we can sew it to the main part of our tree. And here you can see that looks great. I just love the look of this tree and how skinny that trunk is. So I'm just going to sew those two pieces together and iron it. I hope you're loving Crumb Forest as much as I love it. It's turning out so cute. Here I'm just showing you the front and the back, and then I'm going to just trim up the sides, making everything nice and flush. Be sure though, remember that 1/4 inch on each side of the tree. Now I went bigger on one side, shorter on another. It just really didn't matter to me. I was doing improv and anything goes. When I'm all done with all of my trees, I will add white to the top or the bottom depending on the alignment of my trees and how tall I would like them to look on my quilt. For crumb method number 2, we are going to make templates so that we know exactly what size our tree is going to end up being. But first, I'll show you how I made the template. It just so happened that I had a tree-shaped ruler in my sewing room, so I used that. But you don't need a ruler. Any triangular shape like that will do. What I did was I just first traced it out the way that it was, and then I cut that out. And that made one big sort of wide tree. And then I folded that in half. I took that wide tree that I just folded in half and placed it on another piece of paper that was already folded in half. I lined up the edges and I held my finger at the tip of the top of the tree. And then I kind of swung that in and out to make my tree skinnier or wider. And when I got it where I wanted it skinnier, I then drew the line. And I wanted this one shorter too. So I actually just put a line at the bottom of how short I wanted this tree. After you have your paper templates all cut out, it's time to grab some cheap muslin fabric out of your stash. And it can actually be any light colored fabric really, as long as it doesn't show through to the crumb piecing that we do. This fabric tree shape is going to help us piece our crumb tree perfectly. Take your fabric template and lay it on top of a square-ish white piece of fabric. We're going to utilize the same technique that we used in method 1. You're going to slice down the side of your fabric template, the shape of your tree, and then you're going to slice the other side. You should have 2 tree shapes. Put that one that went with the background into your stash for another time. Grab your pile of scrappy crumbs, and you'll want to lay the first one down on top of that white muslin fabric piece and sew right down that seam where I'm pointing. I do recommend pressing after each seam that you sew. So here I'm just going to finger press, and then I'm going to take my hot iron and go across it. You should always work from the middle and then down or up, or vice versa, middle, then up, then down. I sewed this green and red piece together because I thought it would look good and add interest to this tree. So I lay that down right sides together on that first piece that I did, and then I just sew right down. And you don't have to do a 1/4 inch seam. You can do a scant 1/4 inch seam, but I wouldn't go any less than that because you don't want this to rip apart. And then once that's sewn, you're going to go ahead and give it a nice hot press. If you do have a wood clapper, go ahead and use that. It makes things nice and flat. Check out this really cute pink winter Christmas fabric I had in my stash. Oh, so cute. So here I'm going to sew a couple pieces together because I needed a longer length at the bottom. So I'm just going to trim that up so that it fits, and then I'm going to sew that on. Right sides together, just like before. Let's take a look at what we have so far. There's the back, and you see the fabric on both sides peeking out, and the front looks a little odd, but that's okay. Before we trim everything up, we need to add the top of our tree. You see, your fabric has to cover over every area of that white muslin template. Looking good, it's time to trim. Turn your piece over so that you see the back. Line up your ruler right along that white muslin fabric template and just slice. Do one side, then go ahead and slice the next side, and then trim the bottom. The back looks nice and clean, and when we flip it over, we have one of the cutest little trees in Crumb Forest ever. Now add the sides on just like we did in the first method. Add the left side first, and then sew right up, and then add the right side and sew right up that side of the tree. After you sew each side though, be sure to give it a good hot press before going on to the next step, and use your clapper if you have it. Trim everything up and be sure that you leave more than a 1/4 inch on each side and top of your tree because you don't want to cut off your points. These trees are so stinking cute. Oh my word. Look at how darling. Oh. And let's take a look at the back. Now you see that muslin, it covered over everything because we had sewn over top of it. Onto the tree trunk. Now I like these to be tall and skinny because they are tall pines in Crumb Forest. Here I took just a square piece of white fabric, sliced it down the middle, but first I made sure that it was wider than my tree block. So that way it fit in the end and we would be able to trim it up nicely. Make your tree as tall as you'd like it, and I used a 3/4 inch width for my tree trunk, and you can use any scrappy brown that you have in your stash. You're going to sew it in between those 2 pieces of white fabric that you sliced down the center. I did iron my seam allowances toward the center of my trunk, but you can iron them any way that you'd like. Go ahead and trim the tree trunk block on the top so it sits flush against the bottom of your tree. Line them up, and then you're going to sew those 2 pieces together. And no worries if things aren't perfectly straight. I mean, what tree is perfectly straight anyways, right? Now it's time to trim everything up nice and flush. 2 different methods, 2 different trees, but both of them very, very scrappy in Crumb Forest. Both of these crumb methods are so super easy, but use the one that makes the most sense to you. Be sure to check out all of the tutorials that I mentioned in this video. And hey, if you're not a subscriber to my channel and you found value in today's video, you know what to do. And you know I have to say it. What happens in Crumb Forest stays in Crumb Forest. Until next time on the Sewing Channel, take care.